Hey everybody, John Fenn. What you call earlier, I had some technical difficulties. All right, technical difficulties. Hey, today's title is "Don't Be a Squirrel in the Road." Again, my name is John Fenn, Church Without Walls International, CWOWI.org, and here to talk about the discipleship process. Now, if you go to our website, CWOWI.org, you can sign up for my weekly thoughts, which is a weekly email, and things like that. There are lots of material for you. Today, talking about don't be that squirrel in the road. And what do I mean by that? Well, here's a picture of a squirrel. Now you'll notice the squirrel has its eyes on either side of its head. The same thing with a rabbit. There's a picture of a rabbit. And you notice the eyes are on either side of the head. Folks, a squirrel and a rabbit are prey animals. Not P-R-A-Y, but P-R-E-Y. In other words, they are designed to be food for other animals. And their eyes are on the side of their head so that they can look out for predators which are coming upon them. Sometimes people act like squirrels in the road. If you have driven very much, or if you have lived in North America, and I'm sure parts of Europe as well, those little tree rats, as we commonly and affectionately call them, will sometimes get in the road, and when they get in the road, they zigzag. They go zzz, 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 trying to get out of the way, and you think, just get out of the way, you stupid squirrel, because they go choom, 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 choom. And the reason for that is very simple. Because they have eyes on one side of their head, when they see a car coming from one side, their fear says, oh, turn the other way. So when they turn the other way, the eye on the other side sees the car and says, oh, turn the other way. And so it turns that way, so it zigzags back and forth. So if you've ever driven along and have seen a squirrel in the road, you know that it'll zigzag back and forth before it eventually decides to get out of the way or gets run over one way or the other. But they are prey animals. It makes it very difficult. It makes it more difficult for an animal trying to eat it if it's got its eyes on either side of its head so that it can zigzag out of the way as that predator is chasing it down. If you've ever seen a rabbit run as well, you've got the same thing there. But folks, you and I are human beings. We don't have eyes over here where our ears are. We have eyes straight ahead. And there's a reason for that. There's a design for that. You see, James chapter 1, in fact, the whole of James chapter 1 is about falling to various temptations, tests, or trials. In fact, in James chapter 1 and verse 2, he says, count it all joy when you fall into various temptations, tests, or trials, knowing that the trying of your faith exercises patience. Now, the word patience there is not like the word patience in our time. It's Old King James, and it's derived from the Old Greek. And it means consistency and perseverance. It means being constant in all things. It's not, the word patience in the New Testament is not the picture of, when I was a teenage Christian back in the 70s of a kitten holding onto a branch, with the caption, hang in there, baby. And you've got this little cat or kitten or whatever hanging from this branch about to fall, and it's just got its claws dug in. It says, hang in there, baby. That's not patience. It's not just a matter of like, okay, I'll be patient. Patience in the Greek and patience in the Old King James, when they translated it that way, means to be consistent in all things. Now, you can't be consistent if you're a squirrel. Don't get squirrely. Don't run back and forth. And what James chapter 1 and verses 2 through the end say is this. Count it all joy when you fall into various temptations, tests, and trials. It's the same word. It means temptation, test, or trial. And notice he says fall into. So the word fall means that you stumble into it. In other words, it's not something that you necessarily purposely brought on yourself. It just happens to you. Maybe it's somebody else's decisions that affect you, and it causes a trial in your life. But it's temptation, test, or trial is the word there. And he says, knowing this, that the trying of your faith exercises this consistency in your life. In other words, what Satan is trying to destroy you with can actually prove to be a consistency in your faith to see you through the difficulty. It's like in Genesis chapter 22 and verse 1, where it says God did test Abraham. Depending on the translation, it could say tempt or test Abraham. But that word in the Hebrew means to prove. In other words, God knew what was in Abraham's heart, and he put him in a position so that he could prove what is in his heart. And so that's the way the Lord does things. It's like in John chapter 6 and verses 1 through 6. There was a whole multitude that needed fed, and Jesus told Philip, he says, why don't you guys give them something to eat? And Philip said, we don't have enough money to buy enough bread for all these people. But the Apostle John tells us in John chapter 6, 1-6, he says this, he said, but Jesus said this to test him, to see what he would do. You see, we get in situations that we fall into, and it's not the devil doing it to us. It is in fact, oftentimes it is the devil doing it to us, but it's God's opportunity sometimes to bring out what's best in us. You know, St. Augustine said something like this. The quote is that it was God's choice to make good out of evil rather than to not have evil at all. Okay, that's St. Augustine's quote. It was God's choice, God's decision, actually, was the quote, to cause good to come out of evil rather than to not have evil at all. That's God's, evil is in the world. We can't help that. But what God does is he's an expert at turning what is meant for our destruction into something good for us. Now, he goes on in James chapter 1, and he says, now, if you're in this temptation and test and trial and you lack wisdom, let everyone ask in faith, nothing wavering, because he that wavers is like the waves of the sea that are driven by the wind, and you won't receive anything from the Lord. And a lot of people don't understand that the context is actually asking for wisdom from the Lord. If you're going to ask for wisdom from the Lord for that situation, don't waver in that. It's not talking about wavering in your faith. If you look at the context carefully, it's actually talking about wavering in your decision to seek God's advice on it, God's wisdom on it. And so he's telling us, when confronted with a test and a trial, stay in it long enough to get God's wisdom. Don't waver in that. Don't say, okay, I'm going to go with God over here, but in the back of your mind, you got plan B. God is the plan B. So Augustine also said that Jesus Christ is not valued at all until he's valued above all. Jesus Christ is not valued at all until he is valued above all. In those situations, it's time to value him above everything else. Now, I would be remiss if I did not say that James chapter 1, verse 2 talks about counting it all joy when you fall into various temptations, tests, and trials. I would have to say that joy, remember, is a fruit of the Spirit from Galatians 5, 22 and 23. It's part of the fruit of the Spirit. In other words, it's not happiness. He's not saying count it all happiness. He says count it all joy. That is, you get in touch with your spirit, man. You stay in thanksgiving. You stay in worship. And then you allow that consistency to work out of you as you seek the Lord and his wisdom. And you just say, I'm digging in my heels. I'm receiving God's wisdom in this situation. I'm not going to waver. I don't want man's plan. I don't want second best. I want God's wisdom. And then James continues in verse 13, just so that everybody understands. He says, now let no man say when he's tempted, tested, or tried that God's doing it to him, because God doesn't test evil, doesn't test people with evil. He himself is not tempted, tested, or tried with evil. And then he goes on to say, but everybody is drawn away by their own lust and enticed. And when those two conceive lust, that is the desire in the body, and enticement, they conceive sin, and sin goes through a gestation period and it's birthed. And when sin has its complete work, it'll result in death. He says, don't err, my beloved brethren. Every good gift and every perfect gift comes down from the Father of lights, with whom there's no variableness, neither a hint of turning in his character. So he uses a book in there in chapter 1, both at the start talking about counting it all joy, and then at the middle point in verse 13, and then at 8 in chapter 18 through 20, he talks about how that it's not God doing it to you. My point today is Satan wants you to be a squirrel. Satan wants you to zigzag in the road so that you can get run over. We are not squirrels. Our eyes are set in the front of our head so that we can look forward to the Lord. We can look forward to what is ahead of us. Paul said, this one thing I do is I forget what's behind me and I press toward the mark of the high call of God in Christ Jesus. That's in Philippians chapter 3. And so Satan wants us to be like a squirrel and run out in front of the car of destruction, the car of temptation, test, and trial, and zigzag back and forth. And that squirrel doesn't receive any good thing when he's in the middle of the road and your car is coming along and he's sitting there going zigzag, 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 because out of one eye, his information is telling him one thing, and then he turns away from that in fear, and he turns with the other eye, and here's more information coming from this eye, and he doesn't know which information to receive, and so that, or to take action with, and so he just zigzags, and he gets run over by the car. Don't be a squirrel. Your eyes are in front of you. Stay firm. Count it all joy. That is, work out of your spirit in worship, in praise, and thanksgiving when you fall into various temptations, tests, and trials. These are things that you've not brought upon yourself. and you stay in that worship and you say, I'm going to get God's wisdom on this. It says there in James 1:5, I think it says he upbraideth not in the King James, meaning he won't find fault with you. Just because you're in a temptation, test, or trial doesn't mean anything. He's not going to find fault with you. You just say, I'm going to go with your wisdom in this. I'm not going to be like a squirrel. I'm going to be focused on your wisdom. And I know you didn't do this to me, but I know that there are things to work in me while I seek you and get your provision. That person will receive the answer to their prayer. That person will come out the other side unscathed and even better. So anyways, I hope that's been a blessing to you. Don't be a squirrel. All right. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.